When the smoke of the First World War cleared in 1918, Britain faced an uncomfortable truth. Its empire stretched across the world, but its armories were filled with obsolete weapons. Among them stood the Lewis gun, a squat air-cooled light machine gun that looked ungainly beside newer automatic designs. By every paper standard, it was outdated, heavy, drum-fed, and almost Edwardian in its engineering. The weapon had been designed before tanks even existed. Yet, paradoxically, this old gun would go on serving in battlefields, deserts, jungles, and city streets long after more modern weapons had come and gone. It became the symbol of a lesson the British military would keep relearning, that reliability and adaptability mattered more than technological novelty. The story of the Lewis gun begins before the Great War in 1911, with U.S. Army Colonel Isaac Newton Lewis. Spurned by his own Ordnance Department, Lewis brought his invention to Belgium, where the Arms Automatiques Lewis Company partnered with the Birmingham Small Arms Company, BSA, to produce it for Britain. When the war broke out in 1914, the British Expeditionary Force urgently needed portable firepower. The Vickers gun was dependable but cumbersome. The Lewis, at 28 pounds and operated by a two-man crew, offered something new, automatic fire that could move with the infantry. In Flanders, it proved indispensable. Its air-cooled barrel, wrapped in a distinctive aluminum radiator, allowed continuous bursts without water or hoses. Its pan magazine, holding 47 or 97 rounds of .303 ammunition, gave British platoons the volume of fire that often rivaled German machine gun teams. When the armistice came, tens of thousands of Lewis guns were stored away in depots, expected to gather dust. But the interwar world refused to stay quiet. British forces from Ireland to India found themselves policing an empire under strain. In the 1920s, during the Irish War of Independence, Lewis guns mounted on armored cars clattered through Dublin's narrow streets. In the northwest frontier, RAF airmen strapped them to biplanes to strafe tribal positions. The gun's air cooling, originally meant for the trenches, now made it ideal for early aircraft lacking synchronized firing systems. It became, in essence, the first reliable aerial machine gun, so much so that when the RAF converted to newer aircraft, surplus Lewis guns were handed back to ground units rather than scrapped. By the 1930s, Britain faced another dilemma. New light machine guns like the Bren were entering service, precise and elegant in design, but expensive and slow to manufacture. The Lewis gun, though dated, could be built quickly and operated by barely trained reservists. When war erupted again in 1939, this old veteran re-emerged from storage. British Home Guard units trained with it on coastal defenses. Royal Navy ships mounted twin Lewis guns against low-flying aircraft. Even armored cars in the North African campaign carried them as secondary armament. It was heavy, awkward, and mechanically noisy, but it always worked, and that reliability made it the quiet backbone of countless small fights that never made headlines. In wartime, armies rediscovered the value of good enough. The Lewis gun was never glamorous, yet it bridged the gap between world wars and across continents, from trench to cockpit, from dune to deck. Its story reminds us that innovation isn't only about inventions, about endurance. The interwar decades became a test of endurance for every nation's arsenals. And the Lewis gun survived because it solved problems no one else had yet mastered. In 1936, when Britain began rearming, it found that many colonial garrisons still depended on the gun for defense. Aircraft carrier decks, naval trawlers, and anti-aircraft emplacements all required a dependable, portable, automatic weapon. The Lewis, despite its Edwardian origin, met those needs almost perfectly. Its circular cooling shroud, so often mocked as obsolete, proved invaluable in sea, air, and tropical heat. Where water-cooled weapons corroded or jammed, the Lewis kept firing. Mechanics in Singapore, Malta, and Aden swore by its simplicity. Just keep it oiled, and it would never betray you. When the Second World War began, the gun's second life truly started. Britain had placed its faith in the newer Bren, a marvel of Czech engineering. Yet production bottlenecks meant thousands of units were still short of light machine guns by 1940. The Lewis filled that gap. During the Battle of Britain, it appeared on every kind of platform imaginable, bolted to the decks of destroyers, mounted on lorries for anti-aircraft defense, even affixed to home-built tripods on rooftops around London. Film footage from the Blitz shows searchlights sweeping the night sky as Home Guard volunteers fired upward with glowing tracer rounds from their aging Lewis guns. For a weapon designed before radio communications were common, it was astonishingly adaptable to modern warfare's pace and chaos. In the air, its legacy was even more profound. Early in the war, British and Commonwealth air units still used the .303 caliber Lewis as a flexible defensive gun on older bombers like the Bristol Blenheim and the Ferry Battle. It was light enough for a single gunner to maneuver, and its drum magazine, while limited in capacity, allowed bursts sufficient to drive off enemy fighters. Ground crews improvised spares by scavenging from obsolete aircraft stocks. Some were even remounted on jeeps for convoy defense in North Africa. The desert's blowing sand and extreme heat punished all mechanical systems, but the Lewis thrived for the same reasons it had thrived in Flanders: loose tolerances, generous clearances, and a mechanism that did not demand perfection to function. Its global reach by 1942 was staggering. Australian and New Zealand forces used the Lewis gun extensively in the Pacific until replaced by U.S. weapons later in the war. In the Netherlands East Indies, Dutch troops fought Japanese landings with weapons built under license decades earlier. In Burma, British and Indian troops carried it through humid jungle trails where modern automatics rusted solid. Its hollow aluminum cooling sleeve shed water quickly, and its relatively slow cyclic rate, about 500 rounds per minute, prevented overheating in long engagements. The gun's distinctive clattering rhythm became a sound recognized from the western desert to the Pacific coast. By war's midpoint, engineers were calling it an antique with a pulse, but it was still everywhere Britain needed it to be. Age had not diminished its value. Experience had validated it to be by 1944. The Lewis gun had become a kind of mechanical veteran, scarred, patched, and endlessly redeployed. In the chaos of total war, nations often turned to whatever they could trust, and Britain trusted this design. Even as the Bren became standard issue, the Lewis lingered on every front that lacked industrial supply chains. In the jungles of Burma, where supply drops were unpredictable and humidity ruined weapons in weeks, Chindakolams carried Lewis guns because they could be stripped, cleaned, and fired again without special tools. Australian patrols used captured Japanese Type 92 mounts to steady their old British guns. Royal Navy landing craft approaching Normandy on D-Day bristled with twin Lewis mounts guarding against strafing runs. The same gun that had fought at the Somme now watched the beaches of France half a century later. Part of its longevity came from its mechanical philosophy. Unlike later weapons designed around precision machining, the Lewis was a product of industrial pragmatism. Its gas-operated piston system tolerated wear and dirt. Its rotating bolt, though primitive by later standards, locked firmly and safely even in misaligned receivers. Its designers had assumed imperfect production and compensated accordingly. That meant units in the field could interchange parts from different factories without trouble. Armorers who worked on them said it was a soldier's gun, forgiving, predictable, and nearly impossible to ruin permanently. When firing, its low cyclic rate made the recoil pulse gentle, enabling short, controlled bursts ideal for defending trenches or convoy perimeters. Crews often remarked that it talked rather than roared, a steady rhythm that inspired confidence more than fear. When German forces captured examples early in the war, they quickly pressed them into service under the designation MG-137. The Wehrmacht, too, valued its reliability, especially for second-line and coastal defense units. The Japanese Navy produced their own licensed copy during the 1930s, adapting it for 7.7 millimeters ammunition and mounting it on aircraft. Even the United States, which had once dismissed Isaac Newton Lewis's invention, used leftover guns for airfield defense and naval patrols in the Pacific. Few other weapons of its generation crossed so many flags, while keeping essentially the same design. It was, in every sense, an international survivor. As the war drew to a close, thousands of Lewis guns again faced retirement. But the world of 1945 was not at peace for long. Insurgencies and civil wars erupted from Greece to Indonesia. In many of them, the Lewis gun appeared once more, wielded by colonial police, irregular militias, and freedom fighters alike. Its distinct circular magazine and stubby barrel became an icon in post-war newsreels. Journalists covering the Greek Civil War filmed government troops, firing them from sandbag emplacements. In Malaya, Commonwealth forces carried them on patrol against communist guerrillas. Everywhere Britain's influence lingered, the Lewis gun endured, still performing the same task it had in 1914, giving infantry a mobile wall of lead when they needed it most. That end the immediate post-war years. Britain faced a world transformed by decolonization, austerity, and the new geometry of the Cold War. Yet the Lewis gun, designed before tanks and radios, continued to find a place in this uncertain era. Many Commonwealth nations that emerged from British rule inherited entire stockpiles of them. In Kenya, Rhodesia, and Malaya, the gun became a fixture of jungle warfare. The Malayan emergency of 1948 to 1960, often called the Forgotten War, demonstrated the enduring practicality of the design. British and Gurkha patrols cut through dense undergrowth where newer weapons like the Bren frequently overheated or clogged with foliage. The Lewis gun's open-air cooled system and slower firing cycle allowed sustained bursts even in oppressive humidity. Its old-fashioned pan magazine, though awkward to reload, was easier to keep dry and free of mud than fabric belts or open-top box magazines. The same lessons that applied in Flanders and the Sahara once again proved their worth in the tropics. For the Royal Navy, the weapons service stretched even further. On Arctic convoys, small escort ships kept Lewis guns mounted as anti-aircraft weapons well into the 1950s. When the Korean War erupted, Royal Navy minesweepers operating off the peninsula still carried them on their bridge wings. The gun's simplicity meant crews could maintain it without specialized armorers or spare parts, an advantage when operating thousands of miles from home. Some ships paired the weapon with improvised radar directors, giving the old gun a new role in an age of jet aircraft. In photographs from 1953, sailors can be seen standing by a twin Lewis mount during Coronation Fleet reviews, its iconic pan magazines glinting in the sunlight amid modern radar arrays. It looked anachronistic, but it still worked, and no one replaced what wasn't broken. On land, the gun's reputation as a workhorse only deepened. Police forces across the Commonwealth retained it for riot control and defense. The Royal Ulster Constabulary in Northern Ireland kept Lewis guns a service until the early 1960s, mounted on armored lorries for crowd dispersal and checkpoint defense. Across the Atlantic, Canadian Reserve units trained with them through the early post-war decade, using them to bridge shortages of newer automatics. Even in film and popular media, the Lewis gun refused to fade. War movies of the 1950s, The Cruel Sea, Dunkirk, and Reach for the Sky, used genuine surplus guns to recreate combat scenes, their rattling bursts instantly recognizable to veterans. By the mid-1950s, it had become more than a weapon. It was a relic that still performed its duty. When the British finally phased it out of frontline service, they did so not out of failure, but out of inevitability. New calibers, NATO standardization, and lighter alloys demanded a fresh generation of designs. Yet even then, few soldiers who had carried the Lewis ever spoke ill of it. They knew its quirks, respected its endurance, and recognized in it a quality rare in military hardware: trust. Even as it slipped quietly from official inventories, the Lewis gun refused to vanish from the world's battlefields. In the 1960s and 1970s, decolonization wars and local insurgencies brought it back into action once more, sometimes in the unlikeliest hands. Across Africa and Asia, independence movements and militia groups unearthed the gun from long-forgotten arsenals, its simple mechanics forgiving decades of neglect. In the Congo crisis of the early 1960s, UN observers reported mercenaries and local forces both using Lewis guns scavenged from colonial stores. In Indonesia and Borneo, Commonwealth troops facing Indonesian infiltrators sometimes heard the unmistakable slow clatter of their own antiquated weapon echoing through the jungle at night. The irony was not lost on them. An Edwardian gun, now used in jet-age proxy wars. The British Army had long since moved on to lighter belt-fed automatics, but the Lewis endured in training ranges, auxiliary depots, and civilian hands. Its ubiquity and surplus status made it a favorite for technical experiments. British engineers modified several to fire 7.62 mm NATO ammunition in the early 1960s, testing whether the ancient design could still serve in reserve roles. The trials proved the mechanism robust, but outdated in ergonomics. Yet even then, the gun's internal balance and recoil control impressed those who fired it. In many respects, it still outperformed hastily produced post-war copies from other nations. Decades of refinement had turned its oddities, its heavy barrel jacket, its top-mounted pan magazine, into hallmarks of stability and simplicity. In Northern Ireland's early troubles, photographs occasionally showed police auxiliaries standing guard with Lewis guns, antiques by any measure, because they were available, legal, and familiar. The gun also gained a second cultural life as an icon of Britain's interwar and early wartime spirit. It appeared in documentaries, historical reenactments, and museums across the Commonwealth. Veterans would tell stories of how it just kept going, of the comforting rhythm of its fire, of how the same weapon had protected them from Zeppelins in 1916 and from dive bombers in 1940. To them, the Lewis was not merely a piece of machinery. It was continuity made metal. Collectors and small nations continued to keep it operational into the late 20th century. Some were still firing during the Rhodesian Bush War in the 1970s, a time when computers-guided missiles and supersonic jets fought overhead. The Lewis's reliability and simplicity appealed to militias operating without logistical support. Even in conflicts like the Falklands War of 1982, a few Argentine outposts were photographed with ancient Lewis guns in static defense roles, proof that a design conceived before the First World War could still project power nearly 70 years later. By the dawn of the 21st century, most surviving Lewis guns had found homes in museums and private collections, yet its mechanical logic lived on. The concept of a lightweight, air-cooled, shoulder-fired automatic weapon shaped everything from the Bren to the M60. What began as one man's rejected invention had become the ancestor of every squad-level machine gun that followed. When historians trace the arc of British military innovation, the Lewis gun stands as a quiet counterpoint to the myth of progress. It was not the sleekest, lightest, or most advanced weapon of its time, yet it endured longer than almost any of its contemporaries. Its continued service from the trenches of Ypres to the jungles of Malaya tells a deeper story about the kind of ingenuity that wins wars, not the invention that dazzles engineers, but the one that survives neglect, weather, and error. Every detail of its construction reflected that philosophy. The broad aluminum cooling shroud, the simple gas piston, the top-mounted drum. All of them made sense to a soldier who might be cold, exhausted, and fighting with numb fingers. In an age obsessed with innovation, it succeeded by embracing imperfection. Its designer, Isaac Newton Lewis, could hardly have imagined that a weapon rejected by his own army would become a cornerstone of British firepower for half a century. Yet the gun's adoption by Britain and the Commonwealth embodies the pragmatism that defined the Empire's approach to warfare. It was a weapon born from necessity, refined by experience, and kept alive by need. The British Army did not cling to it out of nostalgia. They kept it because it worked. The same reliability that made it useful in 1914 made it indispensable in 1940 and relevant in 1960. Few technologies, military or otherwise, can claim such continuity. There is also a philosophical lesson hidden within its story. The Lewis gun's reputation was not built in laboratories or factories, but on the confidence of the men who carried it. Soldiers trusted it because it fired when asked, even after crawling through mud crossing deserts or surviving monsoon rain. That trust created a feedback loop of confidence. Crews maintained it well, officers planned around it, and commanders kept it in inventory. When viewed across the decades, the gun's persistence mirrors the larger British military ethos, cautious modernization anchored by field-proven reliability. The Empire's ability to adapt without discarding what still functioned became a defining strength during 2 world wars. By the time the last Lewis guns were withdrawn from reserve lists, the weapon had become a living link between eras. It had fired from the wings of biplanes and the decks of destroyers, from trench parapets and jungle clearings, from city rooftops and desert dunes. It had defended monarchies, empires, democracies, and even their rivals. In every role, it delivered the same steady rhythm of fire, a sound both archaic and reassuring, like the ticking of an old clock that still kept perfect time. Its steel and walnut embodied a principle every generation of soldier rediscovers: that in war, simplicity endures when sophistication fails. Today, restored examples sit behind museum glass, their cooling fins polished and magazines neatly displayed. Visitors see an antique. Veterans remember companion. The Lewis gun's long service is more than a testament to engineering. It is a reminder that endurance is its own kind of genius, that sometimes the old ways keep winning long after the world has moved on.